Hello New Zealand and welcome to another episode of Wreck and Roll. I hope you had a decent break over the Christmas. I know I certainly did. I did a whole lot of nothing and thoroughly enjoyed it. So we're straight back into it again. I will not muck around. We are starting with shipwreck number 61, Masa Maru 15. Commercial fishing in the 1970s was a big industry, and vessels from all over the world came to fish in the waters off New Zealand. Technology had advanced and it was now easier to find the fish and catch more of them. Japan was especially keen on the tuna fish and would sail great distances to catch them. Masa Maru 15 was one of the tuna fishing vessels that would set out to find them. She was built in 1968 in Japan and was owned by the Takei Jidgyo Kabushiki Kaisha of Koshi from the island of Shikoku. She had a crew of 22 and weighed 282 tons. In May of 1971, the Masa Maru had been fishing in the waters off Australia and New Zealand outside their exclusion zones. A crew member of the ship had become sick and so was to be taken to Wellington Hospital for treatment. The plan was for the Masa Maru to meet another Japanese fishing boat which would ferry the crew member back to the ship. The place chosen for the handover was 21 kilometres southeast of Cape Palliser. Masa Maru arrived at the rendezvous spot at 9:50 p.m. on Friday the 28th of May. A series of mistakes would ensure that the fishing vessel would not still be afloat at sea by the time the sun rose the next morning. The first fateful decision was to extinguish the navigation lights. All that remained were the ship's drifting lights. These were normally used to help illuminate fishing operations at night. The deck watch was then relieved of his duty. The next watch came on, but not to scan for danger around the ship, but to keep an eye on the freezer, which housed their catch of tuna and some crayfish that had been purchased in Australia. The captain did not want anyone sneaking in to steal his dinner. The ship's master shut off the engines and retired for the evening. The radio operator also went to bed, only rising at 2 a.m. to record the weather report. The Masa Maru was unmanned, insufficiently lit and unpowered, and she had also started to drift towards the Wairarapa coast. All the while the crew were asleep in their beds, oblivious to the coming danger. The master of the ship, Tetsuo Yamaoka, woke at 6:20 a.m., 40 minutes before his alarm. Something had woken him, what he later described as some abnormality. He made his way to the pilot house and started the engines, just in time for the ship to ground itself. The Masa Maru had drifted over 30 kilometres during the night and now found herself stranded 4 kilometres from Te Awaiti station. Chief Engineer Torokio Miowiwaka said of the stranding in the inquiry, "I think most of the ship must be damaged. We did not get very much water as the ship was very high on the reef, and I am not sure if there is any water in the engine room as I did not have time to check as I started to smell ammonia." The crew was successfully removed from the vessel and the ship's master, his radio operator and the chief engineer were required to attend an inquiry into the stranding. At the end of the proceedings, it was decided that blame rested on the ship's master. Any claims that the Masa Maru was illegally fishing in New Zealand waters were dismissed. The owners of the ship saw it as a loss and claimed the insurance. A salvage firm, the Unit Shipping Company, and their 50-year-old tug, Unit Shipper, took on the task of freeing the ship from the rocks. It was not an easy job. It took several attempts to free the fishing ship. A salvager also tragically lost his life when a heavy line struck him in the head during one of the attempts. After 3.5 weeks, the Masa Maru was pulled from the rocks and taken to Nelson, where she was put into dry dock. Repairs were made and she was put up for sale. Right, now I'm going to play a piece of music. Now, because we're getting towards the end of this shipwreck series, we are struggling to find some decent songs about ships and shipwrecks and boating and stuff. So we are now playing songs about the sea. So it's stretching a little, but here is Children of the Sea by Black Sabbath.
We've lost the rising sun, a final sound.
And that was Black Sabbath, fronted by the late, the great Ronnie James Dio. Right, straight back into it again. We have a rather short one. This happens sometimes when you research as much as you can, but you just can't find everything that you want. This is Valiant B. The Valiant B was a 53-foot fishing launch and had been built in 1961 in Patea. She had started out as a pleasure craft but had been converted into a fishing boat. On the 22nd of August 1974, Peter Payne was out fishing on the Mary Rose, a vessel owned by Ralph Wilton. At 9 p.m. he heard a distress call on the radio. Another fishing vessel was foundering nearby. The Valiant B had set out on a crayfishing trip with 3 men from Wellington on board. When they were near Arkitio, just over a kilometre from shore, their vessel sprung a leak and began to take on water. The leak could not be plugged, and the Valiant B began to sink. The crew managed to get out a radio message, hoping that someone would receive it in time. Luckily for them, Payne was fishing nearby. The Mary Rose arrived at the scene of the foundering Valiant B, and the 3 Wellingtonians were brought on board just in time. The Valiant B promptly sank beneath the waves. Payne took the 3 men to Castle Point, where they remained for the night. The next morning they travelled back to Wellington. The same day as the Valiant B's crew returned to Wellington, wreckage from a fishing boat washed up on the Porangaho coast in Hawke's Bay. Napier Police notified Masterton authorities of the event. This small piece of news was reported in the papers. The wreckage was washed up on the beach near Herbertville, in the same area where a fishing boat had sunk last Thursday night. In all, the coverage of the foundering of Valiant B in the newspapers was minimal. It was a quick, passing event. Even the names of the 3 Wellington men did not make the Wairarapa papers. Yeah, I told you it was a short one. Right, back on to the next one. This is Quest. On the 1st of August 1975, a storm hit Wairarapa. Roofs were torn off, trees were uprooted and windows were shattered. By 3:40 p.m, a civil defence emergency had been declared. Power was cut to many homes and sheets of corrugated iron were flying all over the region, one even wrapping itself around a power pole. Half of the roof of the Howard Booth Sports Rackets Club had been torn off, and one window was broken. Rain flooded in and caused considerable damage. Borthwick's freezer building on Waingawa lost an estimated 6,000 square feet of roofing. Damage from Featherston and Martinborough was initially not known, as all communication to those areas had been cut. While the storm was ripping roofing and downing trees on land, a different scenario was playing out at sea. The 32-foot yacht Tangara was sailing to Wellington when the storm started to hit. While off the coast of Hawke's Bay before the sun had risen, she was sailing through 20-foot seas and sent out a radio signal to say she was in trouble. An aircraft took off from Napier to search for her at first light, but found no trace of her. Luckily, the Tangara had been able to sail south and she made it to Castle Point, where she was able to report that she was safe and the crew unharmed. She rode out the rest of the storm at anchor, sheltered from the worst of the conditions. Further south off the coast of Tora, the fishing vessel Quest was also caught up in the storm, but shelter was difficult to come by. She was spotted struggling in the conditions by another fishing vessel, the Cornishman. Not long after the Cornishman last sighted the Quest, she heard a distress call on his radio. The Quest was foundering. 3 men on board the Quest, Trevor Andrews, Donald King and Captain Donald Terry. At 11:55 a.m. the distress signal was sent out. Half an hour later, the Quest had sunk. The lifeboat had been launched just before their vessel had sunk and the 3 men were able to climb on board. But the sea at this point was very rough, and the small boat was soon washed over by a large wave, taking the 3 men with it. They managed to get back on board again, only to be turned out when the lifeboat was flipped over. They managed to right it and climb back in, only for the boat to be flipped once again. The winds were now blowing at 60 knots, atrocious conditions to be in a small lifeboat. King made it to the boat, but he was the only one to do so. His shipmates Andrews and Terry were soon lost in sight in the stormy seas. At 2:55 p.m, a full-scale search had been launched to find the Quest. The Cornishman was searching in the area she had last seen the Quest. The 2,579-ton cement ship Milburn Carrier, bound for Westport, changed her course to join the search. At 6:22 p.m, just on dusk, the Milburn Carrier spotted a flare that had been fired. She sailed to investigate and found King, somehow still clinging to the Quest's lifeboat. He had been knocked into the sea countless times and had not seen his crewmates for 4 hours. The Milburn Carrier remained in the area to search for the missing men, but then departed for Westport when word was received from Wellington that the search was being called off. King had survived impossible odds, firing his flare at the perfect moment. He was saved from an awful fate, but his crewmates were never recovered and became 2 more victims of an unforgiving Wairarapa coast. It's time for another piece of music, and again following what we've been doing before, this is another soundtrack piece. This is from the, I think it was 1963 film Jason and the Argonauts. This is by Bernard Herrmann, and this is called Prelude. Interesting piece of music. There's something about 1960s movie themes that are quite bombastic. I quite like them. Right, on to our last story. This is Ben Veg. The Ben Veg was a scow, a type of flat-bottom barge that was able to transport cargo in shallower waters due to its small draft. Scows had fallen out of use by the latter half of the 20th century, and by the time of her construction in 1976, the 42-foot Ben Veg was reported to have been the first scow to be built in New Zealand in 50 years. In 1980 she was purchased by Abby King Turner, who planned to use her to service his mussel farm at Canoe Bay in the Marlborough Sounds. The idea was to sail her from Great Barrier Island to her new home. At the beginning of December, Captain King Turner and 2 crew members, Doug Evans and Tim Berry, set off in the Ben Veg for their trip south. When she approached the Wairarapa coast on the 5th of December, the weather had changed. Winds were picking up and the sea had become very rough. Soon winds were gusting at 60 knots, and the Ben Veg was finding it difficult to navigate in the conditions. The waves were so high, some were breaking over the wheelhouse. The vessel's 40-horsepower engine was not coping, and due to the strain placed on it, the exhaust became very hot and caught fire. This was quickly extinguished, but the crew realised they could not make it to Cape Palliser. The Benvedge would have to seek shelter somewhere else. She made for Tora instead, and dropped her anchors to sit out the storm. At midnight, the anchors were dragging, and the Benvedge was slowly being driven towards the shore and the waiting rocks. Under the immense strain, one anchor snapped its metal flukes and was now useless. The crew would have to weigh anchor and try to avoid the rocks. But things did not go according to plan. After firing up the engine to get them away from the shore, the anchors became tangled. While the crew attempted to free them, the Benvedge gave a shudder. They had hit a rock. Fearing the loss of the propeller, the engine was cut. Now powerless, the vessel ran over several more rocks before coming to rest on Sandy Beach, near the mouth of the Awhia River. The Benvedge was miraculously not holed, and any leaking was controllable. Crew members Evans and Berry jumped out, spending the night in the sand dunes. Captain King Turner opted to stay with his stricken scow. He described the Benvedge Wairarapa adventure as the worst and roughest night I have ever spent at sea. Early the next morning, the locals awoke to see a new visitor on their beach. Bert and Christine Tyre offered the crew a place to stay while the situation was sorted out. 20 people eventually turned out to assist and unload a ton of equipment from the Benvedge, which was stored in the Tyre's shed. Captain King Turner expressed his gratitude to all of those who had come to help. Everyone has been marvellous. Without their assistance, we would have had to abandon it. There were 20 or 30 people carrying gear up to the top of the beach, he said. 2 anchors were set to try and keep the Benvedge stable, but the 3 to 4 foot waves, one snapped. 3 days after stranding, an attempt was made to recover her, but the persistently strong winds made this impossible. On the 13th of December, there was a meeting of locals at Tora to discuss how to go about saving the Benvedge. The tides were not suitable at that time for a rescue attempt, but they looked more promising the following week. On 16th of December at 9:15 a.m, the Benvedge was finally refloated after 10 days stranded on Sandy Beach. The efforts took 2 hydraulic diggers and a bulldozer to get her back out into deeper water. An inspection showed that the damage was minimal. She remained offshore for a short period before heading to Wellington for an insurance inspection and any necessary repairs before sailing on to her new home in Marlborough Sounds and a quieter life amongst the mussels. Right, that's all I have time for today, but of course I cannot leave without torturing you with some more nautical related humour. What do sailors use to blow their noses? Anchor chiefs. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, we will catch up with you again next Monday. Same rec time, same rec channel. Until then, have a brilliant week.